The wind howled through the icy streets of Chicago on the morning of February 14th, in the year 1929. It was a day usually reserved for romance and affection, but in the gritty underworld of the Prohibition era, it would soon become synonymous with one of the most brutal crimes in American history. The city was a battleground where rival gangs fought for control over the lucrative bootlegging trade. On this particular morning, the tension that had been simmering between two powerful factions was about to boil over in a garage on North Clark Street. The events that unfolded would shock the nation and change the public perception of organized crime forever. Inside the unheated brick garage of the SMC Cartage Company, 7 men gathered. They were members and associates of the North Side Gang, led by George Clarence Moran, who was better known as Bugs Moran. They were waiting for a shipment of hijacked whiskey that had been promised to them at a bargain price. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of oil and gasoline. These men were hardened criminals used to the violence of the trade, but they had no idea that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. They checked their watches and stomped their feet to keep warm, unaware that their time was running out. Outside the garage, a black Cadillac touring car pulled up to the curb. It looked like a police vehicle complete with a siren and a gong mounted on the running board. 4 men exited the car. 2 were dressed in police uniforms, while the other 2 wore trench coats and fedoras. To any passerby, it looked like a routine raid. The residents of the neighborhood were used to seeing police activity around the garage, so few paid much attention. The disguised men entered the building with confidence and purpose. They were not there to make arrests. They were there to eliminate the competition. Inside the garage, the 7 men were ordered to line up against the north wall. Believing this was a standard police shakedown, they complied without resistance. They turned their backs to the intruders and placed their hands against the cold brick. It was a routine they had likely gone through before. They expected to be patted down, disarmed, and perhaps hauled to the station for a few hours before their lawyers secured their release. The false sense of security was the linchpin of the plan. The victims were calm, waiting for the handcuffs that would never come. Suddenly, the silence of the garage was shattered by the deafening roar of Thompson submachine guns and shotguns. The 4 intruders opened fire on the 7 men standing against the wall. The hail of bullets was relentless, tearing through the air and filling the small space with smoke and the smell of cordite. The victims slumped to the floor, their bodies riddled with ammunition. The attack was swift and overwhelming, leaving no chance for survival or retaliation. It was not a fight. It was an execution designed to send a message to anyone who dared to challenge the dominance of the South Side Gang. The shooters did not flee in a panic. They maintained their disguise until the very end. The 2 men in trench coats raised their hands in the air as if they were being arrested, and the 2 uniformed men marched them out of the garage at gunpoint. This clever ruse fooled the few witnesses who were watching from nearby windows. They believed they were seeing the police apprehending the gunmen. The 4 men got back into the black Cadillac and drove away at a leisurely pace, disappearing into the traffic of North Clark Street. They left behind a scene of carnage that would haunt the city for decades. The real police arrived shortly after, alerted by the neighbors who heard the gunfire and the howling of a dog trapped inside the garage. When they entered the SMC Cartage Company, they were met with a gruesome sight. 7 men lay dead or dying on the concrete floor. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The air was still heavy, with the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder. It was immediately clear that this was not a random act of violence. It was a professional hit carried out with military precision. The Saint Valentines Day Massacre had just taken place. The investigation began immediately, but it was plagued by confusion and misinformation from the start. The initial reports suggested that the police were responsible given the uniforms worn by the shooters. This caused a massive scandal and put the Chicago Police Department on the defensive. They had to prove that their officers were not involved in the slaughter. The public was outraged, and the pressure on the authorities to solve the case was immense. Every detective in the city was put on alert, and the hunt for the killers began in earnest. Identifying the victims was the first step. Among the dead were Peter Gusenberg and his brother Frank Gusenberg, who were top enforcers for the North Side Gang. There was also Albert Kashelek, the second in command to Bugs Moran. The other victims included a mechanic, a bookkeeper, and an optician who just happened to enjoy the company of gangsters. The target of the hit was undoubtedly Bugs Moran himself, but he was notably absent. Fate had intervened on his behalf. He had arrived late, saw the police car outside, and decided to grab a coffee instead of entering the garage. The primary suspect was obvious to everyone. Alphonse Capone, the leader of the South Side Gang, and the sworn enemy of Bugs Moran. The war between Capone and Moran had been raging for years, claiming dozens of lives. Capone wanted total control of the Chicago bootlegging rackets, and Moran was the last major obstacle in his path. However, Capone had a rock-solid alibi. On the morning of the massacre, he was in Florida meeting with local officials and prosecutors. He was thousands of miles away from the bloody garage on North Clark Street. Despite his alibi, the police knew that Capone was the mastermind behind the attack. They focused their attention on his top lieutenants and hitmen. One name that surfaced quickly was Jack McGurn, known as Machine Gun Jack. He was a favorite of Capone and had a personal vendetta against the Gusenberg brothers. Police believed he had organized the hit, but proving it was another matter entirely. The code of silence in the underworld was absolute. Witnesses were terrified to speak, and potential informants vanished or turned up dead. The investigation hit a wall until a new type of science was brought into the fold. Calvin Goddard, a pioneer in the field of forensic ballistics, was called in to examine the evidence. He analyzed the bullets and shell casings found at the scene. In a time when forensic science was in its infancy, Goddard used a comparison microscope to match the markings on the bullets to specific weapons. He determined that 2 Thompson submachine guns had been used in the massacre. This was a crucial breakthrough that shifted the focus from vague theories to hard physical evidence. Goddard tested the machine guns owned by the Chicago Police Department to rule them out. He fired test rounds and compared them to the bullets from the crime scene. None of the police weapons matched. This scientifically proved that the killers were imposters masquerading as officers. It cleared the name of the department and refocused the investigation on the gangs. The public fascination with this new scientific method was intense. It was the first time ballistics played such a major role in a high-profile criminal case. As the weeks turned into months, the police followed every lead. They raided known hideouts and arrested dozens of known associates of the South Side Gang. They recovered an arsenal of weapons, but for a long time they could not find the specific guns used in the massacre. The killers had likely disposed of them or hidden them in a secure location. The case seemed destined to go cold. The public demanded justice, but the gangsters seemed untouchable, protected by layers of corruption and fear. Then a stroke of luck occurred in a completely different state. Police in Michigan raided the home of a suspect named Fred Burke, following a traffic accident that turned into a shootout. Inside the house, they found a treasure trove of weapons, including 2 Thompson submachine guns. They sent the weapons to Calvin Goddard for testing. The results were conclusive. The guns found in the Michigan home of Fred Burke were the exact weapons used to kill the 7 men in the Chicago garage. They finally had the murder weapons. Fred Burke was a known associate of the Capone gang. He was a freelancer who often did heavy work for the mob. The discovery of the guns linked him directly to the crime. However, Burke went into hiding and was not captured for over a year. Even when he was finally arrested, he was charged with the murder of a police officer in Michigan rather than the Saint Valentines Day Massacre. The authorities in Chicago could not build a strong enough case to guarantee a conviction for the massacre itself. The massacre had a profound effect on the public perception of Alphonse Capone. Before this event, many saw him as a Robin Hood figure, a man who provided the people with the alcohol they craved during Prohibition. He was charismatic and generous, often opening soup kitchens for the poor. But the brutality of the Saint Valentines Day Massacre stripped away that veneer. The image of 7 men lined up against a wall and gunned down in cold blood was too much to ignore. Capone was now seen as a bloodthirsty monster. The federal government also took notice. The massacre was the catalyst that led to increased federal pressure on the Chicago mobs. President Herbert Hoover ordered his agencies to get Capone by any means necessary. Since they could not link him directly to the murders, they looked for other avenues. This led to the involvement of the Treasury Department and the investigation into the income tax evasion of the gang leaders. The massacre was the beginning of the end for the reign of the Chicago outfit. Bugs Moran, the intended target of the massacre, was never the same after that day. He had lost his best men, and his power base was shattered. He managed to survive for many more years, but his influence in the Chicago underworld dwindled rapidly. He eventually died in prison, a broken man convicted of a petty bank robbery. The massacre had effectively destroyed the North Side gang, leaving the South Side gang as the undisputed kings of the city. The garage on North Clark Street became a macabre tourist attraction. People flocked to the site to see the bullet holes in the brick wall. The owner of the building eventually tore it down, but the bricks from the wall were saved and sold as souvenirs. Some were even reassembled in a nightclub for a time. It was a testament to the dark fascination the public held for the era of gangsters and gun malls. The physical location was gone, but the legend of the massacre continued to grow. One of the enduring mysteries of the massacre is the identity of all the shooters. While Fred Burke was linked through ballistics, the other 3 men were never definitively identified. Many names were whispered in the backrooms of speakeasies. Names like John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, who were known hitmen for Capone. However, both men were killed by Capone himself shortly after the massacre, allegedly, because they were plotting against him. Their secrets died with them, leaving historians to speculate on their involvement. Another theory involved the Purple Gang from Detroit. It was rumored that they had loaned hitmen to Capone for the job, to ensure that no local Chicago faces would be recognized by the victims. This would explain why the North Side men allowed the intruders to enter without a fight. If they did not recognize the officers, they might have assumed they were legitimate. The intricate web of alliances and betrayals between the gangs made it nearly impossible to untangle the truth. Frank Gusenberg, one of the victims, survived for a few hours after the shooting. When police arrived at the scene, he was still conscious despite having 14 bullet wounds. Sergeant Clarence Sweeney asked him who had shot him. Frank Gusenberg, adhering to the code of the streets, until his dying breath whispered, "Nobody shot me." He refused to give up the names of his killers, even as his life slipped away. It was a final act of defiance that protected his enemies as much as his friends. The Saint Valentines Day Massacre marked the climax of the gang wars of the 1920s. It was the most spectacular display of violence in an era defined by lawlessness. It demonstrated the power of the Thompson submachine gun, which became the iconic symbol of the age. The image of the Tommy gun with its round drum magazine became etched in the American consciousness, representing both the terror and the glamour of the gangster lifestyle. The legal aftermath was frustratingly sparse. No one was ever prosecuted for the Saint Valentines Day Massacre. The primary suspects were either killed in other disputes or imprisoned for different crimes. Jack McGurn was assassinated exactly 7 years after the massacre on Saint Valentine's Day in 1936. It was widely believed to be a revenge killing by the remnants of the North Side Gang. The cycle of violence continued long after the original players were gone. Alphonse Capone was eventually brought down not by bullets, but by accountants. In 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The massacre had turned the tide of public opinion and political will against him, making his conviction possible. He served his time in Atlanta and Alcatraz before being released due to declining health. He died in Florida, a shadow of the powerful crime lord he once was. The legacy of the massacre lives on in films, books, and television shows. It has been reenacted and analyzed countless times. It serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of Prohibition and the rise of organized crime. The brutality of the event stripped away the romanticized view of gangsters and revealed the cold, hard reality of their business. It was a business built on blood and maintained by fear. Today, the site of the massacre is a parking lot for a nursing home. There is no plaque or monument to mark the spot where 7 men lost their lives. The bricks from the wall are scattered in private collections and museums around the world. Yet the story remains. It is a legend of the Gangland era, a puzzle with missing pieces, and a tragedy that defines a generation. The ghosts of North Clark Street still linger in the history books. The science of ballistics, which proved so pivotal in the investigation, became a standard tool for police departments everywhere. The work of Calvin Goddard established the first independent forensic laboratory in the United States, which was based in Chicago. The massacre inadvertently led to major advancements in criminal investigation techniques. It was a turning point where old-fashioned detective work met modern science. As we look back at the Saint Valentine's Day Massacre, we are left with a chilling question. How did 4 men walk into a garage in broad daylight, execute 7 people, and vanish without a trace? The perfect execution of the plan suggests a level of sophistication that was rare for the time. It remains the ultimate unsolved crime of the Prohibition era. The shooters may be gone, but the legend of that cold February morning will never die.